Tension escalates rapidly across the Gulf despite last month's ceasefire. An oil facility hit in the United Arab Emirates. Iranian boats attacked while the US tries to force open a shipping route in the Strait of Hormuz. So what does this mean for hopes of an end to the Iran war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. Uncertainty across the Gulf region with the ceasefire between Iran and the US and Israel under increasing strain. The UAE blamed Iran for an attack on its oil facility in Fujairah on Monday, but Tehran is neither confirming nor denying involvement. Iran in turn accuses the US of breaching last month's ceasefire by trying to force open the Strait of Hormuz and hitting Iranian small boats. One of the world's most important shipping waterways remains largely shut, with only a limited number of ships able to pass with US military assistance. While Washington maintains its blockade of Iranian ports, diplomatic efforts brokered by Pakistan appear to have stalled for now. So what's the impact on the fragile ceasefire and the prospects of an end to the standoff? What are the options for each side and the risks of further escalation? We'll get to our guest shortly, but first, this report from Amma Boateng.
A fire breaks out at an oil facility in the UAE on Monday, nearly 1 month after the US and Iran agreed to a ceasefire. The UAE says Iran fired missiles and drones, calling it renewed, treacherous Iranian aggression. Tehran's response has been ambiguous, saying it did not have a pre-planned program to carry out an attack and that the US and the UAE should be wary of being dragged back into a quagmire. In the Strait of Hormuz, there's more tension. The US military says it fired on Iranian forces and sank several small boats on Monday. Iran says 2 of those were civilian boats, killing 5 people. On Monday, Iranian state media also broadcast this video of what they say is the Iranian Navy shooting warning shots at US destroyers. US Central Command says it set up what it calls an enhanced security area in the Strait of Hormuz, aiming to reopen a lane through the strait in Omani waters. That operation follows President Trump's announcement on social media on Sunday night. He said countries have asked the US to help free up their ships. He's calling it Operation Freedom and says the movement is meant to free up people, companies, and countries that have done absolutely nothing wrong. Trump says it's a humanitarian gesture and warns Iran against interfering. Meanwhile, Iran continues to try to use its leverage in the Strait of Hormuz. On Monday, the Revolutionary Guard released a map showing an extended area it says is under its control, far beyond the narrow choke point it shares with Oman. Iran's Speaker of Parliament says Tehran understands well that the current disruption to shipping and energy supplies is unbearable for the United States and that Iran has not even begun yet. The recent events all point to a ceasefire under strain as the US and Iran continue to seek ways to exert influence. Amma Boateng, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest now. Here in Doha is Negar Mortazavi, Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Policy. She's also the host of the Iran podcast. In Washington, D.C., Jason Campbell, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he focuses on international security, geopolitics and foreign policy. And in London for us is Jasmine Gamal, Founder and Chief Executive of Averos Strategies, a geopolitical and communications consultancy firm. She was also a Pentagon Middle East advisor between 2008 and 2015. Thank you so much for being with us here on Inside Story. We really do appreciate your time. Jasmine, if I can begin with you. We heard and saw there an idea of what played out in the Strait of Hormuz on Monday evening, as well as in the UAE. Can you just explain exactly what you think this is right now? Are we watching a deliberate escalation, a testing of limits? Is it all posturing, or is this potentially an end to the ceasefire, do you think?
Well, I think, the term ceasefire has been applied so loosely across the region. In these last 2.5 years, we've seen ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon. and now in this situation that have very, very quickly gone from fragile ceasefires to military action, which becomes very difficult to continue to call it a ceasefire. However, the US president maintains that Iran has not broken the ceasefire yet, which gives you a sense of how he doesn't really seem eager to escalate, but we can get into that later. What's happening right now is one of two things, probably a mix of both. One is the UAE in the last several weeks has gone from, being one of the countries in the Gulf that has had the closest relations and cooperation with Iran to being one of the hardest hit, if not the hardest hit, of the Gulf countries. And that's caused, understandably, a lot of frustration, a sense of betrayal. And contrary to how some other Gulf states have reacted to Iranian attacks on their territories, the UAE has doubled down publicly on its strategic alliance with the US and with Israel, which has led to Iran targeting it even more, a very vicious cycle, if you will. The other thing is that Iran is trying to increase the costs as much as possible on the US, on the UAE, other Gulf countries, in order to get this conflict to a close. If the stakes, I always say this is a war of timelines, which of the parties can maintain the cost for longer, and which party will blink first. And so I think it's important that we see everything that's happening now within the context of those competing timelines.
Jason, we heard Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense, give an update about Project Freedom, basically saying that the US blockade remains in full effect. Iran does not control the strait at all. There is a lane of safe passage that commercial shipping can flow through, and hundreds of ships are lining up to do just that. What, if any, of that is actually true, though?
Yeah, I think part of this, too, is the credibility deficit you have here in Washington among senior leaders, really throughout the course of this conflict, where you'd hear about the largest bombing campaign of the war yet, and Iran almost begging for the resumption of talks, and now all these ships are lining up to transfer through the Strait of Hormuz. Given that in every one of these scenarios, either the result the hoped for result was not met, or the over optimism became apparent quickly, I think we're still in a wait and see approach. What I will say is that, unfortunately for the United States, the U.S. Navy, as currently comprised, is ill-equipped to carry out this type of, escort operation, certainly for a longer duration. It no longer possesses frigates, which are smaller, more maneuverable battleships that would be ideal for this. It does not possess any longer minesweepers or mine hunting ships for the region. So it's using instead these guided missile destroyers that it appears will be less focused on escorting individual ships than going through the strait to provide a little bit of general protection and to hopefully draw any threats from Iran to them. And again, how long this can go on remains to be seen. Perhaps they might try to extricate some of the tankers and other ships that have been largely trapped in the Gulf now for a number of weeks. But I don't see that as is transitioning to some new normal where the Strait of Hormuz is once again effectively open to international shipping.
The war has turned into a ceasefire of attrition by some accounts. Negar, we've also heard that the Iranian statements have been deliberately vague. They're not claiming responsibility or denying it for the missiles sent towards and drones sent towards the UAE. Why is that? To what end, do you think?
I mean, I'm still not sure, because what we've seen as far as pattern and precedent is that the Iranians, especially when it comes to the GCC countries, they telegraphed everything that they were going to do even before the war started. They actually went around and explained to everyone that these U.S. bases in the region are viewed as part of an entire infrastructure that's connected all the way to Tampa, to CENTCOM, and that they're going to be seeing these countries who host the U.S. bases, if they're going to let their air, space, land, the bases be used in a war against Iran, they're going to be seeing them as complicit, directly or indirectly involved in the war, and they're going to attack and retaliate in that sense. And they did that. They did that after the war started. I mean, that was the reason why we know most of these GCC countries actually went to the White House and tried to lobby against the war, warning President Trump that this is going to happen, which apparently wasn't believed in the White House or wasn't taken seriously. But it's just, what makes me skeptical is that they had telegraphed before, they would threaten, and then they would take responsibility. So it's just a little bit unusual. I want to be aware of also the situation of false flags and all of that. And so, I mean, we can still wait and see what happens. But it also is in line with past attacks. And again, that bigger view and doctrine. And let's not forget, from the viewpoint of Tehran, this is an existential war. I mean, first of all, it's an illegal war without a vote from U.S. Congress, UN Security Council, closest U.S. allies. In fact, almost the entire world is saying the U.S. to stop and resolve this. And for the Iranians, they're fighting a battle of survival. And so for them, first of all, international law is dead. We can argue in the region. I mean, after 3 years of genocide, the way Israel is defending itself. And also this war came to them, and it's not the first time. It started last year in June with the 12-day war. From the Iranian viewpoint, that war never stopped. There was a ceasefire, and then the war came back. So what they're fighting, first and foremost, what they're fighting for is to make sure they stop the war permanently. I think what the Iranian thinking right now, the doctrine is that we are going to fight this war. They're willing to continue, make it a war of attrition with the asymmetric escalation, bring it to a point when there's enough deterrence established and the permanent end is so guaranteed that the war will not come back. The war keeps coming back to them, the thinking that's a higher cost than fighting it to a point of stop. And that's why we see all of the strategy. And then, of course, Hormuz is their golden card, or the main leverage that they've played as part of this big strategy.
And many argue that they have played it extremely well to put as much pressure on the US as possible. Jasmine, the UAE, you touched on this before, reserves the right to respond to Iran's latest attacks. Reports they have been very frustrated that there hasn't been a strong enough response from some of its neighbours in the GCC. Do you think that this potentially could be the tipping point, that they actually get more aggressive against Iran?
Well, look, theoretically, there could be, and they certainly have capabilities. They have a very capable Air Force. They can do limited strikes, standoff strikes. I mean, they can allow the U.S. to operate more freely from its territory. There are a range of things that the UAE can do. But the question really here is escalation a good idea? Does escalation actually lead to potentially further attacks on the UAE? And that is the equation here that they're weighing. And other Gulf countries have weighed this equation as well. This is why you've seen different responses across different countries, with some countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, for example, really favoring de-escalation and putting their weight behind the Pakistan-mediated talks, despite reports otherwise, because there have been leaked reports or sort of stories in the press saying that Saudi Arabia has been asking the U.S. to escalate, which is not the case. But that's the question here. It's about whether further escalation is really the smart thing to do, whether it puts the UAE in an even more difficult position.
Right.
I agree with Negar completely about the idea that U.S. military bases and personnel were always going to be at risk in the UAE. And when I was at the Pentagon, certainly in any war planning scenario, when it came to war with Iran, we were prepared for Iran to do that. But I do think from the Gulf perspective, and I can see that perspective, Iran has gone a lot further in its retaliation beyond just U.S. personnel and bases in those countries to civilian and energy infrastructure, which is why the stakes are much higher for them. The question they're asking themselves is, if we don't respond now, given even with all the risks of responding, does this set a precedent for what can happen to us in the future?
Okay, Jason, just staying with escalation at this point in time, many have argued that Donald Trump, the US administration, was given the perfect opportunity to escalate the situation with direct threats towards its navy in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as the threats towards the UAE. Why do you think he didn't take that opportunity?
Well, I think right now, even the administration understands that there's going to be limited political gain from tit for tat military escalations. And what I mean by that is a resumption of strikes within Iran, or this continued targeting of some of the fast boats, which again, in a defensive manner like we've seen, I think are certainly justified. But in terms of the assets it has in the region right now, it's difficult to foresee a quick strike that will materially move the strategic needle in America's favor. So when you're talking about what are the military options right now, you've heard some of these ground-based options, be it at Karg Island, being an attempt to reach and confiscate the highly enriched uranium. Some of these other options, or to forcibly open the strait through military means, you're talking about significant dedication of U.S. ground forces for timelines that are unpredictable, with heavy risk and very questionable strategic upside. So right now, I think the administration is somewhat confined to responding to Iranian threats as they present themselves. But in terms of an offensive operation, there's no real silver bullet strike that's really going to materially change the way the Iranian regime looks at its position in this conflict right now.
Okay, Negar, we heard that this is a war of timelines, that basically whoever can handle the economic pain, especially for longer, will prevail. You said that Iran wants to work out a way to stop the war permanently. How does it go about doing that from the position that it's in right now?
Well, just to build on what Jasmine was saying, also Jason, to your question, I mean, for the Iranians, they didn't choose this war. This war is, unlike the U.S., who chose this war, it's still unclear why President Trump chose this war. I mean, Jasmine probably knows better than me. This was a plan mostly pushed by Benjamin Netanyahu that was put in front of multiple U.S. presidents. We know
but they
President
do now
Bush
have to deal with it, the consequences of that. Even if they didn't ask for it, they didn't want it, they were in the middle of negotiations. So what do they do from here?
And, just to clear that point, it's been put in front of Republican and Democratic presidents. Nobody took it because it was understood that it wasn't going to be easy. For some reason, it was believed in the Trump White House that Iran is a paper tiger, that we can go in. This was believed last year and then again this year, that we go in from the sky. Somehow people rise up. We're going to change the regime. This is going to be a Venezuela model. It's going to be a cakewalk. And it just isn't. What they have seen is that Iran, for them, this is an existential war. For them, they didn't choose it, but they're defending the homeland. They're defending their sovereignty. They also have the advantage of geography. They're the home team, basically. And they have no other choice but to defend and continue this war. But to the point of fighting it, I mean, Tehran has been under economic pressure for years, if not decades, the most severe economic pressure. Is one of the most sanctioned countries on earth. Yes, there's pressure on the economy, on ordinary people, working class, middle class Iranians, but that hasn't really led to policy change in Tehran. And I doubt that it's going to during this war. The thinking in Tehran, and if anybody follows this through history, culture, years of civilization, independence, sovereignty, and that defense takes precedent and priority over anything else. So they're willing and able to absorb more economic pain. They also have a higher tolerance for pain just because of this experience. And I don't think more economic pain at this point in a form of blockade or even more sanctions is going to lead to any policy change. In fact, it may harden their position.
Right.
What I think, just to conclude, is the way out of this war, which wasn't a cakewalk. It didn't lead to any of the purported U.S. goals, regime change, nuclear program, is a diplomatic solution. But what needs to be understood is for diplomacy to work, you need to meet halfway. You need to make concessions. I feel like President Trump still oscillates between wanting that big deal, that grand bargain, but not willing to give anything for it. He still wants surrender even at the negotiating table. And when he goes to the table, he doesn't get that surrender. He wants to go and push more militarily by force on the battlefield to then force the Iranians to capitulate. And they just haven't done that. I mean, literally, top brass, top leaders in Iran have been dying in assassinations and not surrendering. I just don't think they're going to do that with more force, with more pressure.
Right. Obviously, it's not just Iran and the US that is dealing with the fallout from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This is turning into a widespread global problem. We heard from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defence, saying this is just a temporary mission for the United States. The world needs the Strait more than we do. We expect the world to step up. We will hand responsibility back to you. Jasmine, they've so far shown absolutely no sign of doing any of that. I mean, what is Trump actually going to have to do here to try and draw some of his traditional allies to help him in the long term?
Well, I mean, this is the problem, right? This is the opposite of you broke it, you own it, you fix it. This is Trump breaking things and expecting other countries to come in and participate in a solution. As Negar stated before, the U.S. and Iran were in negotiations for the second time in 2 years before the U.S. decided to strike. And when, she was saying, I'm not sure why President Trump thought this would be easy, I think it's because he is surrounded by people who tell him what he wants to hear. He also was coming out of the Venezuela operation with a lot of confidence, feeling very sure that he could repeat this in Iran. And of course, with Prime Minister Netanyahu's assertions that this would only take a few days. Now, that, of course, hasn't happened, and we are now trying to solve a problem that didn't exist before the U.S. went and struck Iran along with Israel. The issue here is whether other countries want to help assume responsibility for opening the strait, whether they do it by force, whether they do it by diplomacy, whether they do it through bilateral conversations with Iran. On one hand, they don't, countries, for example, here in Europe, in London, where I'm sitting, countries are weighing whether to enter into an arrangement where they could be putting their own assets at risk if they go in and try to do something with the U.S. But also, if they're negotiating bilaterally with Iran, it's also rewarding bad behavior on that side as well. So right now, you are seeing discussions happening in the UN Security Council and talking about whether there's an international framework, that there's some way that the Security Council can be involved and try to do it through that framework. But it certainly is not. It's not easy, and it's going to take, as Negar said, the U.S. coming to terms with the fact that it will have to make concessions, but also with Iran coming to terms with the fact that no country in the world will allow or be happy with Iran suddenly controlling the strait for years to come.
Yes. Well, on that point, we know that the US under Trump and Hegseth want to continue on with Project Freedom. Jason, you said that the US Navy is ill-equipped to carry it out in the medium to long term. How dangerous is that if they do continue trying to allow ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz with the aid of the US Navy, and Iran potentially tries to stop that from happening?
Right. Well, Iran continues to maintain many of its asymmetric threats. It has, by most estimates, hundreds of more mines it could deploy. It has an array of fast ships. It has anti-ship missiles that are ground-based that could be used. So it really is a question of whether this is more of a shorter-term, rescue operation of sorts to help extricate some of the ships that have been stuck in the Gulf now for weeks, or if it's the ambition is a bit grander. And even then it gets more complicated because ultimately you're talking about commercial vessels that would have to be willing to buy into what will remain a very risky environment and proposition without some sort of a political accommodation made. So from a military standpoint, again, the U.S. has some options in the near term, but in terms of moving that strategic needle, it's very difficult to see this happening. And never mind the other, broader U.S. Pentagon questions about, maintaining readiness on a more global level and the degree to which they're having to burn through some of their, an array of projectiles and other, air and missile defense capabilities. That would have to be devoted to this type of mission in the long term.
Negar, we've only got a couple of minutes left. You said that we need to find a way to permanently end this war. Obviously, that feels at this point in time like a long way off coming to get a credible, durable agreement. But what's the next step that needs to happen, Negar, from this point on?
I think what makes me hopeful is that both sides want to exit the war. Like I said, Iran didn't want this war. And I feel like President Trump, this is also longer than he wanted. I mean, he ran as president of peace and he campaigned very strongly against these endless wars in the Middle East. And now he's entangled in one of the most complex ones. But I think the sooner it's understood on both sides, like I said, and I agree with Jasmine, that they need to meet somewhere halfway, make concessions, show more flexibility. I feel like they go back and forth, these proposals, the amendments. There's a narrow path, but it makes me hopeful. The role of mediators is very important. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt. Nobody in the region wants this war to continue. In fact, like you said, nobody in the world. This has created a global energy crisis, and it can just increase in different ways: food insecurity, fertilizers, inflation. So the sooner this is understood on both sides, and I think more in Washington, because President Trump still oscillates between wanting a deal and wanting to put more pressure for surrender, and they meet somewhere halfway with the help of mediators, higher powers, potentially China, Russia, if they can step in and put more weight behind this process, I think there's a way to end it, and both sides want to exit it. It's just the understanding has to be there will be no absolute winner in this war, and there will be no absolute loser. Both have to take whatever wins they have and just exit it for permanent peace.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Negar Mortazavi, Jason Campbell, Jasmine Gamal, we really do appreciate your time here on Inside Story. Thanks very much. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage of the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz continues in just a moment. Do stay tuned.